Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another webinar of the World Patients Alliance. Again, I'm Andrew Spiegel. I'm going to very quickly, because we have a couple of new people on, very quickly run through a very short slide of who we are. And then I'm going to turn things over to my fellow board members who are going to introduce today's great speakers talking about accessing healthcare during COVID. So our mission is, of course, to be the global voice of patients working toward empowered, engaged, improved access to safe, innovative, and patient-centered healthcare all around the world. And our vision is that all patients will have access to safe, high-quality therapies and treatments all around the earth. We have 288 plus groups, and the plus I can tell you is that there's more than 12 pending applications right now that the membership committee is reviewing. So we are over 300 members, which is really incredible, from 91 countries representing all diseases from around the world. So for a relatively new organization, we're really proud, and we're thanking all of you for helping us grow by you telling your associates about us. I am the chair currently of the World Patients Alliance. Hussein Jaffrey from Pakistan is the next chair. I don't think he could join us today because he's traveling, but you will hear from our secretary, Penny Cohen, who for 40 years has been running the American Chronic Pain Association. You'll also hear from our treasurer from Poland, Jolanta Belinsky, and we have a director from Latin America, Carlo Ruiz de Castilla, who runs a lung cancer organization in Peru. And we have a director, Regina Kamaga, who is from Africa. And of course, we always have our staff on, Tessa Glenn and Harris Khalid, who run everything behind the scenes. So that's who we are. I'm going to turn things over to Penny Cohen now, who is going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Andrew. And it is my pleasure to introduce a very compassionate and understanding healthcare professional, Ravi Prasad. And he's a psychologist by training and currently the professor and clinical director of behavioral health in the Department of Anesthesiology and Pain Medicine at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine. His clinical work focuses primarily on evaluation and treatment of individuals suffering from acute and chronic conditions. He is actively engaged in leadership activities at regional and national levels, to which he has been involved with interprofessional core competency, curriculum, and program development, lobbying efforts to change policies related to psychological care, the translation of research innovations into clinical practice. Outside the realm of pain, he has an avid interest in clinical wellness and has led efforts to implement associated initiatives in healthcare settings. And it is my pleasure, and I've been working with him for quite a while now, and I can't think of anybody better to address this topic for you this morning. So go ahead and take it away. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Penny. My name is Ravi Prasad, and what I'm going to speak about today is maximizing quality of life in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I'm going to specifically focus on are some of the things that we're able to do for ourselves, largely because at this juncture in time, our ability to access our regular healthcare routes, in a lot of cases, has been compromised. So what are some of the things that we might be able to do for ourselves in the midst of dealing with this truly unprecedented pandemic? For individuals living with health issues of any variety, particularly those that are chronic or progressive in nature, health management can be a very challenging task. Even if there's not a fix or a cure for the condition with which one's affected, the primary goals remain to maximize functioning, minimize the emotional distress associated with the condition, and optimize quality of life. But what exactly does this mean? People sometimes have a hard time grasping exactly how one can achieve these different goals in the presence of an ongoing health issue. So I like to use this particular diagram to try to illustrate what we mean by this management approach to taking care of our health issues. Let's say that this square represents your life. You go somewhere, you go to a meeting. Let's say that we're post-pandemic and WPA has its first in-person meeting. You meet with some of your colleagues who you've only seen on Zoom, and you start having conversations and chatting for the first time. If somebody asks about your life, What kinds of things do we talk about? Oftentimes we talk about our family, we talk about our friends, we talk about sports, leisure activities, vacations, hobbies, music, and then the more mundane things in life. We talk about cooking, cleaning, errands, our chores. These are all the things that give us quality of life. These are the things that make up our lives. Then one day, a health issue comes about, right? And at first it takes center stage because it's something new. We don't know what it is. We try to get workup to get a better sense of what it is and how we can make it go away. But we still have space for all those other things that give us quality of life. Over the course of time, though, this health issue can become a bit more progressive, or the health issue can become chronic. And as that happens, its impact starts to become more significant. We can start to have decreased activity levels where we pull away from some of the things that give us more meaning, not able to go to our workplace, not able to interact with our colleagues, inability to engage in family activities, going to activities or events with our children, going to things with our significant others. As this starts to happen, we can start to have increased emotional distress, where we may have increased levels of things like depression, anxiety, frustration. And I don't even mean those in clinical diagnosis, but just as we define those words in the dictionary. As this starts to happen, we may develop sleep disturbances. Those sleep disturbances may be the result of the health condition itself. It could be related to the emotional distress we're experiencing, or it could be related to the treatment that we're receiving for the health condition or the distress. It's not uncommon to have an increased number of doctor office visits. As we're trying to tackle this health issue, as we're trying to manage this health issue, most of the human interaction that we have can start to revolve around medical centers and medical settings. And interpersonal problems can start to evolve. As we start to pull away from our life activities, as we pull away from the things that give us meaning, we can start to have conflict with the people that we love the most, significant others, family members. And then lastly, over the course of time, as we're not engaged in as much activity, as we slowly become a little bit more sedentary, we can start to become physically deconditioned, where our bodies get weaker, we don't have as much muscle tone, and our overall level of functioning has declined. But what's happened now is if now we sit down and talk to somebody about our lives, what we hear is somebody talking about their health issue. They talk about the different doctors they're going to see, the different treatments that they're going to receive, the different impacts of the condition. And they're no longer telling the story of their lives, but they're telling the story of the health issue. But it's easy to understand how this transition occurs because that health issue is basically radiated out. It's gone from being something that's just a central focus where we still have space for quality of life to overshadowing all those things that give us meaning. So the goal in health management is to really decentralize the role of that health issue in our life. We may not be able to fix it. It may be something chronic in nature for a period of time, but we want to decentralize the role of that health issue so we can maximize quality of life and have space for those things that give us meaning. And it's a great many people who have worked tirelessly to achieve success in accomplishing this. But then, and many of the people in your respective organizations have done just that, where it's a constant work in progress to try to juggle things so that the health issue doesn't become the central focus in their lives, but they still have that balance where they're doing the things that give them meaning. But then all of a sudden, something new comes along and overshadows all the things that give them the quality of life, which is COVID, right? All of a sudden, this came out from nowhere. Nobody was expecting to have something of the nature of this pandemic, right? And now that has overshadowed everything, where even if a person has decentralized the role of the health issue, has been able to manage all these different things, now this virus has overshadowed everything where there's no longer the ability to engage in all these things that give us meaning. And at first, everybody thought, what, this is something that's just going to be temporary, right? It's going to pass quickly. That was certainly the hope that we all had, that this is going to be something that's just going to be temporary in nature. But as time went on, days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and we realized, what, maybe this isn't going to be something so temporary. And it looks like this is going to be something that's lasting a little bit longer than we wanted. And there is a high level of ambiguity of not knowing what the endpoint is going to look like or when that's going to be. But it's not just the threat of getting ill that's stressful. It's not just the pandemic itself, but in this day and age, there's also an additional burden that we face associated with the media. So with the media, with things like Twitter, with Facebook, with YouTube, all the different news sites that we have available, it's so difficult to try and gauge what's accurate. We get different pieces of news from different sources, and it's difficult to try to know what's a trusted news source. Should I believe something that a trusted colleague tells me? Should I believe something that I saw in a news source? And it's very difficult to try and get an assessment of this. We can start to have conflict with people in our lives, conflict with coworkers, conflict with family members who don't agree with us. And that conflict can start to create more stress in our lives, and it can complicate our ability to manage our healthcare issues. There's also a tremendous amount of distressing news that comes about as we log on to these different social media outlets, or as we log on to our news outlets and the media. Every day we start to learn more and more things about the virus. We learn about more lives that have been taken. We learn about more spread of the disease. And it's just incredibly distressing, particularly as it was going on last year, and we were seeing that there was no particular end in sight. And it's something that was pervasive. You couldn't escape it. Anywhere you go, there would be information about COVID. And that continues to be the case to a certain extent in different areas. So if that's not enough, we also had our shelter-in-place orders that were in place, right? And we can appreciate that some of these orders were put in place to prevent spread. They were put in place to try and help curb the spread of the disease and to promote safety. But they also had an unintended impact of interfering with the person's ability to participate in or receive maintenance therapies that they would use to help maintain their health. Medical care that people would have, their basic needs, such as getting groceries, getting their medications, medication refills, things along those lines. Socialization with other people in their lives. All of these things became affected as a result of the shelter-in-place orders. And so what we found is that the pandemic itself, separate from the disease, separate from getting sick, it had its own implications just as it arrived in our world. People started to become deconditioned as they had these shelter-in-place orders and weren't able to go out and about. People had poor sleep, either because of fear of the condition itself or because of the impact that it had. Interpersonal conflicts could start to arise. People had increased number of doctor office visits and a higher level of affective distress. And if we look at this, if we look at these implications, if it sounds familiar, that's because it is. These are the same issues that we all face when dealing with health management, right? But now, instead of the health issue that's causing these things, it's COVID-19 that's causing these. But just like you, or just like members of the respective organizations learned how to decentralize the role of pain in your life so that you could have quality of life, so too is the goal now, to decentralize the role of COVID. We're not able to make this go away. Unfortunately, it's something that's here. We've certainly seen that just with the second waves that we've seen in different countries like India. We certainly know that Australia right now is dealing with some very difficult times as we're speaking right now. But this overarching goal that we have is to get back to managing as best as we're able to, where yes, the pandemic is still there, but hopefully we can have space to maximize our own quality of life within that space that we have. So what I'm going to focus on specifically are some of the things that we might be able to do for ourselves to help accomplish this, recognizing that access to healthcare during this period of time can be limited. Access to different types of mental health clinicians is limited and variable in different parts of the world. Again, I want to focus on what can people do for themselves to help maximize quality of life. So I want to start by talking about one of the most tangible aspects of what everybody's experiencing right now, which is stress, right? So certainly living with the pandemic, dealing with all of its implications is exceptionally stressful. But why is this something that's important for us to recognize or appreciate? Well, whenever all of us are wired the same, whenever we get exposed to stress, basically the brains are always on, the brain is always processing information around us. One of the things that the brain is responsible for is detecting the presence of threats or stresses in the environment. Whenever the brain detects the presence of a threat or a stress, it activates a part of the nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system. When the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, there's a whole host of changes that happen in the body. Heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, muscle tension increases, blood vessels constrict, a stress hormone called cortisol gets released in the body, our pupils dilate, breathing patterns change, and there's a whole host of other systemic changes that happen in the body. What also happens when you get this nervous system activation is that our immune functioning gets more compromised. As the brain detects that a stress is no longer present, it activates another part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which helps the body get back down to its previous baseline. So the heart rate returns to normal, blood pressure goes back down, muscle tension decreases, blood vessels expand. All of the activation that occurred just returns back to its normal baseline. But again, particularly as we're looking at dealing with chronic health conditions, this has profound significance because of its effect on immunity and the impact it can have on general health. So we know that short bursts of cortisol release can actually boost immunity, but when we have exposure to chronic stress or chronic hyperarousal of the body's nervous system, this can actually lower immunity. Well, as we're dealing with the pandemic, first of all, we're dealing with the chronic stress, we're dealing with the chronic health issue, but when we superimpose the pandemic on top of that, that's something that can potentially lead to this chronic hyperarousal and chronic stress. And that can lower immunity, it can worsen health outcomes. So we want to try to do something about that to minimize that likelihood. So what are some of the things that we can do? Well, one of the things that we can do are breathing exercises. Now, in breathing exercises, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to target this parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system axis. And what we do is by regulating our breathing, doing deep, slow breathing, and regulating what we're thinking about as we do it, we're helping to trigger activation of the body's central nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. But there's several steps that are necessary for that to happen. Number one, the breaths have to be deep, they have to be slow, and we have to control what we're focusing on. So for example, if we're trying to do some deep breathing exercises to try and quiet this nervous system reactivity, recognizing that we're experiencing a high level of stress, but we keep thinking about something stressful in our minds, well, we may be trying to behaviorally quiet this physiologic reactivity in the body, but then our thought processes are going to reactivate the nervous system. So the net effect of the process is going to be nothing. And we're going to walk away from that saying, well, the breathing exercises didn't work. Because even though we're behaviorally trying to quiet the breathing, the thought processes even though we're behaviorally trying to quiet the nervous system, the thought processes are reactivated. So it's like if we have a fire in front of us and we're pouring water from one side but gasoline from the other, the net effect is zero. So we have to regulate what our thought processes are and focus on something that's not stressful. It might be a peaceful image. It might be something that gives us peace. It might even be just a simple counting system. And you'll notice that I have a numbered system here next to the word slow. What I usually recommend that people do is use a counting system where you inhale to a count of 5, pause for a brief second, exhale to a count of 5, and pause for another second before starting that cycle over again. Now, this should feel very wave-like. It shouldn't feel jagged, where you take a breath, inhale, hold, exhale, hold, start the cycle over again. It shouldn't feel jagged, but rather completely rhythmic, where you inhale, you feel like you can't get any more breath in, there's a natural pause. You exhale for 5 seconds, feel like you can't get any breath out, there's a natural pause before we start the cycle over again. But as we do that slow breathing, that helps make it deep. As we breathe deeply, that helps make it slow. Again, doing this type of breathing is triggering the body's parasympathetic nervous system, and it becomes like a relay race. It's the first bar, the first handoff in a race, where as we do this, it sends a signal to the brain that there's not a stress present. And so the brain then starts to activate the parasympathetic nervous system to help calm and quiet the body down. So muscle tension relaxes, blood vessels expand, heart rate returns to normal, the release of cortisol is stopped, And this is something that we teach people who are living with pain. This is what we teach people that have chronic cardiovascular disease, a wide range of different things to help gain better control over the physiologic impact that stress has. But in order for it to be effective, it's important to practice it on a consistent basis. This isn't going to be something that works just because in the heat of the moment you try it. It's a skill set that has to be developed through practice over the course of time. But that's just one tool. And one of the things that we have to do there is to learn to regulate our thoughts. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about thought management right now. So as human beings, we act as if we're stimulus response creatures, that something happens and we have our emotional, physical, and behavioral outcomes as a result of that situation, right? But the reality is it's not a situation that causes us to feel the way that we feel or behave the way we behave or have the physiologic responses that we have, but rather it's the way that we interpret a situation. And this is the crux of cognitive behavioral theory, which has just that it's the interpretation of situations that leads to our consequences rather than the situation itself. Now, I like this model very much because I find it very empowering, because in life, we can't always control the situations that we find ourselves in, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. None of us want to be in this predicament. We're dealing with chronic health issues, but this is a situation that we find ourselves in. So even though we can't control that, we can control how we choose to interpret the situation so that we can have the power to influence the consequences that we have. Now, this doesn't mean that it's mind over matter. This doesn't mean that we can use our thoughts to make our health issues disappear or make COVID disappear. No, it's not that. But we can use it to help impact the extent of the depression, the anxiety, or the affective distress that comes with our diseases or comes with this time that we're living with. It can help motivate healthier behaviors and decrease some of that physiologic reactivity that we have within the system. So for example, let's say that the situation is that a person has a high level of exhaustion because they overextend themselves. If they think to themselves, well, the day is lost, the day is ruined, there's nothing I can do, the pandemic ruined my life. Well, naturally, a person might feel some degree of anger, sadness, anxiety, frustration. They may be more irritable and they may snap at others. And these are all stressors. So the brain is going to interpret this as something stressful. It's going to trigger sympathetic nervous system reactivity. As the body has sympathetic nervous system reactivity, muscles are going to tighten up, vessels get constricted, their body is going to be more depleted of their resources. Immune function is going to go down, and that sense of exhaustion is going to get worse. As that happens, their thoughts become more polarized, the emotions become more extreme, the behaviors become less healthy, and the cycle just feeds on itself. So where can we break this cycle? Well, we can't change the situation. We can try to target the emotions or the behaviors, but making changes there is going to be short-lived if those thought processes are still perpetuated. So we target the thought processes. But when we target the thought processes, there's two specific things that we ask ourselves. Is this helpful and is this accurate? Not, is this positive versus negative? A lot of times people think that it's about positive versus negative thinking, but that's a little bit too simplistic. The reality is that we know that our unhelpful outcomes typically come when our thought processes start to lose their accuracy and helpfulness. And if we can't answer yes to both of these questions as we analyze our thought processes, then it's time for us to modify those thoughts until they are more helpful and more accurate. So for example, with the example that I just had up here, if a person is thinking the day is ruined or the day is lost, there's nothing I can do to control this, the pandemic ruined my life. Well, let's ask ourselves, are these helpful? Are these accurate? Well, the answer to both of these questions for all these thoughts is quite simply no. So we have to modify these thoughts. So how do we do that? Well, the day is lost. Well, I don't know what the day is going to look like, but I'll do my best. There's nothing I can do. Well, I've learned tools that I can use to navigate this. And the pandemic has ruined my life. Well, the pandemic has been hard, but there are things I'm still grateful for. So you'll notice that as we modify the thoughts, we're not just turning things into positive statements, but rather we're trying to make them a bit more accurate and a bit more helpful, right? So with this, The same situation, you feel exhaustion due to overextension, but now you have the modified thoughts. I don't know what today's going to look like, but I'll do my best. I have tools I can use to navigate this. The pandemic has been hard, but I have things for which I'm grateful. Well, you may still have some degree of sadness, anxiety, or frustration, but the severity of it is going to be less. There's a better likelihood that you'll move into healthier self-management behaviors and you'll continue to be engaged with others. You may still have some degree of nervous system reactivity, but the severity of that is going to be less. And it's not going to have that effect, that compromising effect on the immune function. And so what you've essentially done is you've broken the cycle by changing the thought processes, right? But this is easier said than done. It's easy to illustrate this with an example like this, but it's much harder because our thought processes tend to be automatic in nature. And a lot of times we're not aware of the thought processes we have, but it's a very important thing for us to be able to do, to get in touch with what we're thinking and make these types of modifications. But as we deal with the pandemic, we have more than just the physiological experiences and the role of our thought processes, but there are other things that are unique to the pandemic that are occurring. There's a strong sense of lack of control, right? There's only so much that we're able to do on our own, but we can't change the trajectory as a single human being, right? And so as this goes on, we can start to have a lot of helplessness, anxiety, and frustration, right? And as those things start to happen, that can trigger these emotions and it can worsen, it can cause more physiologic reactivity, which can worsen our outcomes. So what we want to do is we want to look at what are the things that we have control over, right? And recognize that there are things that we cannot control and things that we can control. And sometimes this sounds very simplistic. That, well, yes, of course, that seems very obvious, or things we can and can't control. But it's important to recognize this because a lot of times, particularly when we're feeling overwhelmed, we get this sense that there's nothing that we can control. And that's only going to further fuel that sense of helplessness and hopelessness. But it's important to recognize the things that we can control. So we can't control what other people say, what other people do. We can't control ourselves, the closure of public spaces, schools, workplaces. We can't control on our own the longevity of the pandemic or the loss of loved ones. But we can control how we react to what other people say, how we react to what other people do. We can create activities to keep ourselves or to keep our families busy. We can maximize our own personal safety and self-care as this pandemic goes on. And we can allow ourselves to grieve. We can seek support as we deal with some of the losses that we have around us. So these are some of the things that are in our control. And it's important to maximize those things that are in our control, our behaviors, our thought processes. And it's also important to recognize and acknowledge the things that are not in our control. But we want to make sure that with those things that are not in our control, that we don't just engender a sense of helplessness there, but that we use coping resources to help deal with those. So again, what might be some of those coping resources? Breathing exercises, looking at the role of thought processes to see how our sense of helplessness might be magnified by the messages that we're telling ourselves. So focusing on the things that we can control. What are some of the things we can do on a day-to-day life? The more that we do on a day-to-day basis that we exert control over, the more it starts to hack away at those things that we have a loss of control over. So in our daily activities, adhere to all the precautionary measures that are in place to minimize risk. Every locale has different things that are in place, and so you want to adhere to what those are to minimize what your risks are. You want to try to minimize, limit your media exposure. You know, as we said before, exposure to what's happening is so pervasive, and it can be overwhelming just to turn the TV on or turn your devices on and learn about things, that you may want to limit this so that you don't get that sense of being overwhelmed. It's so very important to stay connected to family and friends during this time. Even though we may be physically distancing ourselves from others, this doesn't mean that we have to stay disconnected socially. So pick up the phone, organize a Zoom call, you know, do the things that you're able to do to safely remain connected with people. Another thing that's important that we can do that ideally we might still continue even after the pandemic is at the end of the day, identify 3 good things that happen during the day. And there's been research that was done out of Berkeley, California, that identified some of the positive things that come from identifying 3 good things. So at the end of the day, and this should be something thoughtful, what are 3 good things that happened during the day? And why were these things good? Why was it that these things made you happier, made you feel content? By doing this exercise, what you're basically doing is you're forcing yourself to think back at the positive things that happened during the day. And what unwittingly starts to happen is throughout the day, you start to become more aware of the positive things that are happening for you. So this has a positive impact in that respect. But what it also does, by making yourself look at what the mechanism is for why this made you feel happy, it helps you become more aware of those things that drive your happiness so that you can seek more of those things out on a day-to-day basis. Other things that you can do to maximize your control. Regulate your diet. It can be very easy when we feel overwhelmed just to end up eating and not eating as healthily as possible. Our sleep schedules can start to become a little bit dysregulated, but you want to try to adhere to the same sleep and wake schedule as best as possible. You want to get regular exercise, whatever that might be, doing what you can to keep the body as fit and toned as possible. You want to monitor alcohol intake. We've seen over the course of this last year an increase in alcohol consumption, certainly in the US, but you want to make sure that you're regulating how much alcohol you take in. And we can introduce relaxation training, those breathing exercises to try and help quiet the physiologic reactivity and quiet the physical impact that this takes on us. On a day-to-day basis, when you're living in your home environment, you want to define a separate space for any kind of work or appointments that you have. Even if you don't have a large home, it might be just that there's one small space that you dedicate for work and such, so that you still at least have a mental separation between your personal home life and your medical appointments or your workspace. You want to adhere to a specific schedule. It can be easy, especially if you're working from home, for your personal life, your home life, your work life, all to blur together, but you want to try to adhere to a specific schedule. Let work be work, home be home, and try not to blur those, because then it can be very easy to get overwhelmed where everything just feels like it's coming at you at once. And again, you want to make sure that you check in with your support systems, family members, friends. These people are there to help you, and you want to utilize your support system as much as possible. And then lastly, we get to our emotions. What do we do with these? Well, I want to validate that it's perfectly normal to feel the full gamut of emotions that you might feel. You might feel sadness, joy, anger, fear, disgust. Any of these emotions might come about, and it's perfectly fine to feel those because you're human, and these are all just normal human emotions. The goal, though, is not to get stuck with any of these emotions, because as we experience these or get stuck with, well, with the exception of joy, there's nothing wrong with getting stuck with the joy, but with some of the more negative emotions, if we get stuck at those, then what can happen is it can lead to that chronic hyperarousal of the body's nervous system, and that has poor health implications for us over the course of time. So it's perfectly fine to feel these emotions, but we want to try to minimize getting stuck in some of these more negative states. So this was just a very quick and rapid overview of some of the different types of things that we might be able to do to self-manage in the midst of COVID-19. I appreciate that in 30 minutes, there's a lot to cover. There may be questions that people have. So please feel free to send me a message if you have questions. But also, I think we do have a couple of minutes for some Q&A time. And so I will turn it back over to my colleagues for that Q&A time.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. That was amazing. And actually, we don't have any time for questions right now because your talk was so in depth. And I think coming from the pain space, which I've been dealing with for many, many years, my focus is on that, redirecting your attention off of the pain and onto something I'm more control over, and focusing more on your abilities and your disabilities and all the tools you gave us for providing the way to actually manage the impact that COVID has just been excellent. So please, if you have questions, he had his email up there. but you can also email office@worldpatientsalliance.org, and we can get the questions to him. So again, thank you so much. That was just an excellent overview. And I wish we had more time to give you so that you could really get into depth with some of these things. So thank you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Yolanda Galinsky, who is from Poland. She's the treasurer of the WPA, and she'll be introducing our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. It is a really pleasure to present you Anna Śliwińska. She is the president of Polish Diabetes Association. Anna has been working for the Polish Diabetes Association since 2007. Then I also met Anna first time during my work for patient organization. In 2015, she was elected president, and then she was re-elected in 2019. What is she doing? Her everyday activities include direct work with diabetes in the entire Poland. Often, if I call Anna to ask something about NCD, especially about diabetes, she is running over the whole country. To the Polish Diabetes Association belong 350 regional circles. So she is raising diabetes awareness in the society and officially representing diabetes, particularly in the efforts to improve diabetes care and access to proper treatment in Poland. I need to tell you that Anna is in touch with Minister of Health, with WHO officer in Poland, and also with almost all organization members which deal with NCDs and also with others, with all organization when the patient is in the center. Thank you, and Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jolanta, for this very nice introduction. We've known each other for quite a few years now. I think, Jolanta, also you do a really fantastic job in Poland. Also, Poland is a place where there is a lot to do. So I think there's never enough of us, and we can work 25 hours a day, and that's still not enough. So if I may share my presentation with you. So I would like to tell you today about the access to healthcare for different disease patient groups in COVID times. And especially since I represent the Polish Diabetes Association, I would like to tell you more about diabetes. And it's a great honor for me to speak to you today. I hope you will find my presentation useful. So just a few words about Polish Diabetes Association. Our association was established in 1981, so that was 40 years ago. And the fact that the association was established was almost miraculous because Poland was a communist country then, and it was not really allowed to form any sorts of organizations. So that was really amazing back then. And we are now one of the biggest and oldest patients organizations in Poland. We have about 60,000 members. And as Jolanta said, we have about 350 regional branches or circles around the country. So that really is a lot. And our major goal is diabetes education. So we educate patients and their families in the fields of diabetes. But also, as Jolanta said, we represent diabetics, we spread diabetes awareness in the country, and we also try to improve the healthcare system for patients with diabetes. So some data. In Poland, we have about 3 million people with diabetes, which is between 8 and 9% of the population. But also we have between 500,000 and 1 million of undiagnosed patients, if you can imagine. Those are people who really risk a lot in their lives by being undiagnosed. And there are also about 5 million people who are at risk of diabetes. So as you can see, that's really a lot of people to work with. Major problems in diabetes in Poland. So late diagnosis. As I said, in Poland, there are even up to 1 million people who are undiagnosed. And the reason for this is mostly, let me put it this way, stupidity. Because a lot of people don't want to be diagnosed. They say that they prefer not to know if they have diabetes or not, as if, they pretend that if they are not diagnosed, they are healthy, but they are not. And that's a huge problem because undiagnosed diabetes is like a ticking bomb. People may have heart attacks, strokes, and then this really is too late for diagnosis. Also, another problem is simply lack of awareness. So this is something we work with. Another problem in Poland is diabetes education or the lack of it. Because in Poland, only children who are diagnosed with diabetes and their parents really get proper education. So this field is okay. But when people are diagnosed with diabetes as adults, they really get no diabetes education. So people go to a doctor's appointment, they find out they have diabetes, and that's basically it. And during their next appointments, of course, they may talk to their doctors about diabetes, but that's only 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. So that's really not enough to get any proper education. Reimbursement. So in Poland, reimbursement is fair. It's not bad, it's not excellent, it's fair. Especially reimbursement of medications and new technologies for children and adolescents with diabetes is very good. In this respect, Poland reaches very high levels. However, again, when it comes to adults, reimbursement of new modern medications is fair. Of course, in Poland, like in many places, there are problems with long lines to specialists. And this is, of course, a problem for every single patient, not only for diabetics. But diabetes is a disease which requires the care of many specialists, like, for example, eye doctors and other specialists. So people with diabetes tend to visit specialists more often than other people, and they really have to wait in long lines. And as they wait, their complications get worse, so nothing good comes out of it. So what was the situation during the early days of COVID-19? At the very beginning, there was some panic buying of medications. People really did not know whether medications would be available or not. So at the beginning, they tried to buy everything they could. Of course, that was unnecessary, as we saw later. People also were not sure about their medical appointments and prescriptions. They didn't know whether that would be available or not. However, online consultations quickly took over, and there was absolutely no problem with medical appointments. Although, of course, not everyone liked online consultations, and there were a lot of people who complained about it, as I will tell you a bit later. A lot of procedures got cancelled. So people who needed to have some minor or even some major medical procedures, those procedures got cancelled because the government decided that if something is not life-saving, like a life-saving procedure, that could be postponed. Of course, this is not good, but that's how it was in the early days of COVID-19, and also a bit later, at later stages as well. Diabetic patients were very quickly worried by the information that people with diabetes are at a higher risk of severe course and death from COVID-19. I don't know if you are aware, but about 1/3 of all people who died of COVID had diabetes. So obviously, when you have diabetes and when you hear that 1/3 of all of those who died from COVID also had diabetes, then you can imagine that people really got frightened. So what was the situation with the access to healthcare during COVID-19 in Poland? It turned out that there was absolutely no shortage of medications. If there were some shortages, they were not extraordinary and they were very short lasting. So there was really no problem with any medications. As I said, online consultations took over. And at the beginning, a lot of people were satisfied with online consultations because they were happy that they do get some medical consultations at all instead of having everything cancelled or postponed. However, as time went by, people became more and more dissatisfied with online consultations, which was especially characteristic for elderly, for seniors. And they were those who really were not happy with the new system or with the new normal. And they were those who all the time complained and wanted regular consultations to take place again, even though they did carry some risk of COVID infection. But still, people said that online treatment is no treatment at all. Also, as I said, there were delays in screening, in care, in treatment. All those non-life-saving procedures were delayed. And as I said at the beginning, in Poland, people usually have to wait in long lines to visit specialists or to have any treatment, any procedure. So as you can imagine, now with COVID, the delays and the long lines got even longer, which is very bad. The Ministry of Health is now trying to do something about it. They promise that everyone who needs to see a specialist will be able to see a specialist still this year, but we don't know how this is going to work. In Poland, people can get private care if they can afford it, but private care is very expensive. And of course, it's not fair to make people pay for screening, for treatment, for care, for procedures if they want to have it sooner, because most people cannot afford it. So those delays are indeed a problem. Also, there was a problem with new diagnosis, and I mean diagnosis of diabetes, because when people get diagnosed, it's such a life-changing moment, as you know very well, with any disease. When you get diagnosed, it's really a life-changing moment. And to be newly diagnosed during the COVID pandemic, that definitely was not a good time. I mean, no time is good for being diagnosed with a chronic disease, but still, during COVID, that was a problem. How our association tried to help during the COVID pandemic. So we introduced a special helpline in April and May, because back then, in April and May of 2020, because at the very beginning of the pandemic, we were not sure whether there would be any consultations, like online consultations. So we decided to help with the special helpline. However, as I said, online consultations were readily available, so there was no need to continue the special helpline. But the helpline helped people to get some diabetes education, to give some advice, to give them any information they needed. And also we were able to give them prescriptions for medications. So that was nice. Also, we kept that constant communication with our members. So anyone, if they had any problem, they could always call us or write to us. We gave them all possible advice in any given field, whatever they needed, especially since they were so scared, as I told you, of severe cause and death from COVID-19. We tried to offer them advice and support. Also, we provided in our media, because we have electronic, of course, digital media like everyone, but also we have a magazine, a free magazine, printed magazine that we sent to our members. And in all of those, we provided reliable and constant information on coronavirus. Because as you know very well, especially at the beginning, but also during the entire pandemic, there was a lot of misinformation and myths and false information, fake news, and so on. So we were the ones who provided reliable and truthful information, for which we actually got praised nationally. In national media, we got praised for our information on coronavirus. Also, we had to intervene because we had a strong feeling, and I'm pretty sure that was the case everywhere, that other diseases other than coronavirus were forgotten, as if our patients, people suffering from diabetes and also from other diseases, as if they were not patients anymore, as if there were no other illnesses in the entire world, only the coronavirus. So we really had to intervene with the Ministry of Health, with the Polish government, with the Prime Minister, just to make them remember that other diseases still exist and that people's condition gets worse if they do not get proper treatment and care. Also, at a certain point, we had to intervene in order to actually limit online consultations. Because as I said, as time went by, people were becoming more and more dissatisfied with online consultations, especially the elderly. And at a certain point, we had to remind the Ministry of Health that patients still need their doctors. You know, especially in diabetes, when you have diabetes complications, like when you need to see an eye doctor, or if you suffer from, especially from diabetic foot syndrome, this cannot be dealt with via online consultations. So we really had to, at a certain point, fight with those excessive online consultations. And that we managed to do. Now it's much better. Practically everyone who wants to see their doctor, they may see their doctor. If they still want to have an online consultation, they still may. Also, we participated in many online conferences, seminars with key opinion leaders, with governmental officials, because they also were interested to know our opinion on what was happening, on the entire situation, on what we felt like as patients, what our opinions were on certain decisions or projects they were trying to introduce. So we really participated very actively in all of those. So our voice was heard, and we did have some influence on what was happening. And also what's very important, we tried to, the whole time during the whole pandemic, we tried to encourage our members to keep up healthy lifestyle. Because as we know, people really stopped taking care of themselves during the pandemic. A lot of people, as also it was said earlier today, you know, with excessive alcohol consumption, with no exercise, no physical activity, with unhealthy food, junk food, with overeating, with smoking and everything. So during the whole pandemic, we tried to tell our members that there's nothing worse for their health than forgetting about healthy lifestyle. Because as we know very well, healthy lifestyle is a key in any therapy. There is no successful therapy of any disease without healthy lifestyle. So that's it for me. And thank you very much. If you're interested, please go to our webpage, visit our webpage. If you understand Polish, if not, you can just see more or less what we do. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was so nice and so good overview about the situation. I live in this country, so I know it from everyday life about this overwhelming with info about COVID time. So thank you once again. And if you have any question to Anna, you can send this question to us directly, office@worldpatientalliance.com, and we direct this question to Anna or to Dr. Prasad. Thank you so much. And now I will give you the voice to our chair, Andrew Spiegel. He will do the last remarks. Thank you, Anna, once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to both of our speakers. I learned an awful lot there, and it was amazing to hear the work that's being done and the good advice that's being given. I know we're out of time, so we usually have a question and answer session, but as Yolanta said, if you can simply email any questions you have for our speakers or for our staff to office@worldpatientsalliance.org. Send it to the office@worldpatientsalliance.org, and we will get answers to your questions. Remember that we won't have any further webinars this summer. We're going to take the summer off, but we will be back in September. We will be focusing on new issues, so stay tuned for our next webinars coming up in September. And remember that all prior webinars are recorded and they are available on our WPA YouTube channel, so make sure you're following us there, and on Facebook, on Twitter, and all of those places. So thank you everyone for attending. We're out of time. Have a great summer, everyone, and we'll see you in September.